everybody, welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It's me, Francis, and I have journalist extraordinaire Kelsey Atherton, a man who continues to defy the metric system by measuring things by F-35s, which soon enough will be our only way of measuring things, I think. You mostly do it monetarily, I think pretty soon. How long is an F-35?
You know, I don't know it off the top of my head, which feels at this point like a key failing.
You're supposed to stay up on all the weird memes that you started doing 4 or 5 years ago. You know, it's like me and technicals. I can never get rid of it now. Like I can never just be like, you know what? I don't want to talk about trucks with guns in the back of them anymore. Which is fine because I don't think I'll ever tire of them, but you know, it is as it is. So, Kelsey, I brought you on because you're one of the defense writers that I know who probably dug a little bit into the Chinese spy balloon as it has been getting plastered all over the internet, which seems like an incorrect phrasing of it, because like I would figure that a spy balloon wouldn't be able to be seen from the ground with the naked eye. I feel like China's probably a little bit further ahead in their spying than, you know, let's just huck a balloon over there. But I mean, is it? Was this a spy balloon? Was this a weather balloon? What happened here?
Sure. So the main thing is, I think the easiest kind of direct analog, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is to think of it less like something sneaky traveling undetected and more like a surveillance, like a spy satellite is a term we have, and satellites are inherently visible. You like need a telescope and to have a deep familiarity with the night sky to kind of track and know where specific ones are, but they're not like hidden. They're pretty open. It's the sky does not have concealing terrain in any meaningful sense, except on cloudy days.
Yeah, when you have a cloudy day, it'll be concealing. But you know, I mean, a spy satellite goes over you. There's really not a whole lot you can do. So I don't understand. Like, I mean, I guess with the balloon, I understand because it feels a little bit, I don't know, feels a little bit more personal. But yeah, like you said, like it's not like China isn't snapping photos over America using a satellite. Like if they wanted pictures of Bozeman, Montana, it's not hard to get that. They can probably pull that from somewhere else. So for me, the whole narrative of this being a spy balloon doesn't really make sense. But also, I don't know, like maybe it could be let's throw this one over there so they don't talk about the other 5 balloons that we have going at any given time that nobody knows about for some reason. It seems weird that we didn't know about it until Montana, though. I will say that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that it certainly sets it apart, is that this became news, and it's one rare when Montana is news at all, and it's super rare that it's like, oh, you know, Montana, the border state. But turns out that wind doesn't respect borders and can carry a lofted high altitude balloon just across oceans and through Canada and into Montana. And what really caught the eye of people, because you can kind of just see things up, and I imagine, right, weather balloons go up every day. And so it wouldn't be hard to say like, oh, sure, that's just a weird one in an unusual place. But what did it is that it had to halt flights at an airport in Billings, Montana. And once you get the NOTAM nerds on it, they're open sourcing all the things, and they can find, well, why did they have to shut down this airport for this length of time? It's like, oh, there's a really obvious visible structure in the sky. With a flight path that you can then trace back to having been lofted into the air from China. So the balloon kind of we can tell that it came from China. It's coming over. I imagine, like, did it come over Canada and then come down into the United States? Like, how did it work? Because Montana is not like on the ocean side. You would think that I-Corps, the people who are literally in Washington State, would be like, oh shit, there's a balloon there. Or maybe it's just like, yeah, it's a balloon, whatever. We see balloons all the time. I believe that I saw some report that, you know, balloons flew over us and nobody talked about it during the Trump administration too.
So I don't know what our history with balloons are. I don't know if I should be afraid or not.
So here's the thing. So first of all, it travels from Canada. It follows wind currents. And we're going to go into a bit of a history lesson for one of my favorite weird moments in history. In my fun bleak beat, but during the 1930s, possibly 1920s, a Japanese researcher figured out that there was something called the jet stream, right? That there was a high altitude river of air that circled the globe. And it circled the globe in a consistent direction. It was flowing in a single way. And he published his results in Japanese, which makes sense. He's a Japanese scientist. And he published it in Esperanto, so it was technically available. But if you're publishing in the international language for nerds who love international languages, you're not actually going to get picked up and understood. So this research is out there. But Japan, during World War II, decides to weaponize knowledge of the jet stream, which again it's public, it's why it's published, but it's published in a language people aren't reading or picking up on it. And what they did is they crafted high altitude balloons. They have like school children make them. It's a weird thing, but there's certainly weirder things have happened. And they had these balloons, they're called the Fugo balloons, and they had a system where they would rise during the day. It's a long flight. It's time-wise. You're going as fast as the wind can carry this thing. You're not going under your own power. And it would rise during the day and it would lower during the night. That's just the cooling of the air inside of it. And it would drop ballast. And when it ran out of ballast, it would crash. And these balloons carried incendiary devices. And so in 1944, Japan lofts these balloons up and sends them. But there's a couple limits to this. One is that the months where the jet stream is strongest are like November to March, which are pretty cold and they're pretty wet months. And Japan's plan was to have these balloons with incendiary devices crash into U.S. forests and destroy U.S. infrastructure, destroy U.S. cities, burn as much as they could. And they were technically a successful intercontinental weapon. There's a very goofy National Geographic story about like the first intercontinental weapon. But they hardly killed people, which is not the only point of the weapon, but it's a big point of the weapon. And the people who died, it was most of one family, which is the worst unit of a family that can die in a tragedy, is most of it. And it was because they were picnicking in Oregon, and the mother and 4 kids discovered this weird object and investigated it, and the father was too far away, and then it detonated. Deeply, deeply tragic. You could find the story. The father had a whole separate, continuing tragic life after that. But that's basically it. That's who died from this weapon. The forest fires it started. It was a very wet season, and it was 1944 and 1945 were among the wettest years ever recorded. So they weren't super successful, but that's how you get a balloon across continents. You put it high enough, you trust the wind to carry it, and then these ones had to crash. So they had to figure out a mechanism. They had that whole ballast and rising and falling system to time it so they would crash. But if you're just putting sensors on a balloon, it could just stay airborne until it isn't anymore.
Sure. I know that our first, like the very first, quote, aircraft carrier was a thing that carried surveillance balloons. And really, like, and this is during the Civil War, and really it's just like, oh, there's a battle over there. Hey, you go up and get in the balloon that's just over there. And, we're going to give you a radio that goes down the balloon wire so that you can tell us what's going on. And we can base things off of that. And, the balloon was far enough away that traditional muskets and cannon fire couldn't really get to it, but close enough that a guy with, a spyglass can be like, oh yeah, the Confederates are doing this, the Union's doing that. And so I appreciate the usage of balloons in warfare. In fact, my favorite story about balloons are when two Frenchmen decided to fight over a woman, and the way they did it was they're like, traditional dueling just isn't manly enough for us. We're going to get into balloons, hot air balloons with shotguns, basically the 1800s equivalent of a shotgun, a giant blunderbuss, and just take pot shots at each other until somebody dies. Which absolutely happened. One guy got shot down because he was in a balloon, and the balloon got shot. So, big fan of the usage of balloons. We had balloons in Afghanistan, the big static balloons that look kind of like a big fat missile, where they put cameras and weather sensors and whatnot on the bottom of it. So I can appreciate the usage of balloons in this sense. Like, I know that obviously we shot it down and they recovered what was left of it. The official story from China was that it was a civilian balloon that was launched and went off course. Have we confirmed that? I mean, we picked all the pieces out. Are we able to say, yeah, this is just one of those things, or do we even consider that spying? Like, they're getting our, what the temperature is in Montana. That's spying stuff. Even though you could go onto the Chinese weather apps and get those, I'm sure.
Yeah. So it'll be hard to know, I think, just in general, what actual information was being collected by this balloon. Maybe something will turn up in the open source, but what we know, right, is that it had all this equipment on it. It looks like there were solar panels to power the electronics and the systems on the balloon, and the U.S. Has recovered it from the ocean, but we're going to have to trust on like selective release from the U.S. military and from how that's filtered through the Biden administration, what comes out, and then what China will say about it. And so it's hard to have any sort of verification of what this is or what it was collecting. And so one of the things that has been a lot of focus is trying to think about what could a balloon collect that a satellite couldn't. And especially if it's at the altitudes it was, right? This was flying at between 60 and 65,000 feet. That's what it was when it was shot down. That's still far, like, high enough up that, right, like, cloud cover would obscure it, but maybe it could listen for signals. Maybe it could listen for shorter wave radio traffic and collect that and listen to it. Maybe it could listen for other activity. Maybe it could be pointing video cameras, which when you're high enough up, you can get a really wide aperture and you can see a ton of what's happening below. If you're lower, you can see less of what's happening below, but you can see it in more detail with a similarly powerful camera. That's a trade-off there. And so you might want to do that. It might have some interesting things. One of the early thoughts was like, oh, well, obviously it's flying over Montana because that's where we keep our ICBMs. And maybe it's looking for signs of what day-to-day activity is at missile silos, so that China could perhaps have a baseline for what normal activity looks like versus, say, what like high alert activity looks like. That assumes they'd be able to make that future distinction. But this is all like we're in speculative space here. There are reasons to do things differently than you can with satellites, but there's not a ton of them that are readily apparent.
Sure. It feels like a balloon is something that you do as like a science project. Plenty of people have launched weather balloons that go really high up in the air. You put a GPS tracker on it. You wait for it to fall out of the air. You go find it. You can calculate, distance, speed, things like that. But yeah, like it seems like it would just be a lot easier to just have a satellite, because if they want to know what in your example, like, oh, we want to know what high alert looks like versus low alert, fucking fly the satellite over. The satellites go around the Earth every like 90 minutes, man. It's not hard to like get these shots, based on positioning and things like that. So I don't know. Like even if this was a spy satellite or a spy balloon, I still feel like, what are they going to gain from here that they're not already getting from like half of Americans having fucking TikTok downloaded onto their phones? Like there's other things you should worry about from China than a balloon, I think. Mostly my worries are like when is the stuff that I ordered going to show up? But as I said, it feels like I mean, of course, it's American politicians doing American politician stuff. Hey, a thing is happening. How do we score political points on it? Regardless of whether or not we believe that this is a spy balloon or not. So it's really hard to parse out like what's actually happening here, what this thing is, because everything just comes with so much speculation and so much I hate to use the word, but bloviating about everything that's going on here, and you're not really going to get any kind of truth. And I don't really think we're going to get any truth out of our own government either. So it feels like a wash to me. Like, just fuck it. We shot it down. We'll move on. We'll move on with our lives. I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of my general thing. It was okay. So I was largely offline during the whole like, oh, this is happening. Here's this big thing. So I'm catching up to the story late. I'm seeing things, and at no moment did it feel like, oh, this is an international crisis, and more it felt like it's really weird that we're talking about a balloon. Yeah, so balloons are strange aircraft to view as a threat, right? We mentioned that they have a early history in like musket days of being spotters, and you'd have like semaphore, you'd have like a telegram wire, and that's how you'd send things down. And then in World War I, there was a lot of balloons, and we have I, like many people, got to learn about the Arizona Balloon Buster, a World War I ace who made his name shooting down 18 German observation balloons. Good on you, buddy. I'm sure that was the hardest thing to do. But what a comical
look in World War One. In World War One, in those airplanes that are basically made out of balsa wood and spit and a prayer, yeah, that's I'm the guy in the F-22 shooting down a balloon is a little less impressive than somebody dodging between balloons and shooting them down. I mean, hell, you even think they might have only been able to like have a pistol, like just fly close enough and shoot a gun out the side. Because I mean, balloons hadn't even been around airplanes hadn't even been around 20 years yet at that point. So, you got, I find that impressive on a World War I kind of platform.
It is. And one of the things that's like pretty meaningful. World War I was a pretty balloon observation made a ton of sense. You're still like recording your observations by drawing on paper or film or setting by wire, but the trenches were pretty static. You could see the buildup of movements in advance. It made a lot of sense. It was in tempo with the war, you could say. And this one, it's hard to know. The sensors that the U.S. puts on its tethered balloons for modern war are like radars. You can get a better angle on a radar if you're hanging it beneath a balloon, and you can look at different places or different angles than you could if you just have it on the ground. You get a different picture. You can put cameras up there. You can put up other sensors that are looking for like radio signals or other kinds of communication traveling that might not be visible, but you would want to still capture in the air. Those all make a lot of sense, but as like a data collection tool, basically you're trusting where the wind carries the balloon to be the direction you want to go, and that you'll have sensors on it that can make a meaningful observation out of that. And it's hard to make that work, but it's been useful. It's been useful in the past, and one of the things to point to tie in a little New Mexico story here, as I want to do. The object that crashed in Roswell in 1947. There was obviously 1947 is the big flying saucer panic. The whole Pacific Northwest is filled with reports. People are freaking out. One guy sees a flying saucer, gets big write-up, and then suddenly, after you have one big media coverage, everyone thinks everything they see in the sky is flying saucers. And so a rancher in Roswell, New Mexico, real rural, he'd already stumbled across this balloon. And then he goes to town. He reads about the flying saucer panic. He goes back. He's like, hey, what is all this stuff? Collects what he can find, brings it to the sheriff and says, hey, what is this? The sheriff calls up the army, and the army does something very, very goofy, where the first person they go says, oh, yeah, absolutely a flying saucer. And the army has never gotten over that. That's never gone away. The next day, the army says, no, weather balloon. This was just a weather balloon. It's like, okay, but in the 90s, the Army declassified what it actually was, and it was a balloon. It was a balloon with sensors, but it was an acoustic listening device. The balloon that was recovered at Roswell that set all that off, that made Roswell have this whole alien kitsch market today, was really a tool designed, an acoustic sensor. It was designed to listen for the sound of Soviet nuclear detonations, because that's something you could pick up and relay, and you could pick up at high altitude in that way. And so there's a long history of sending sensors. The U.S. has sent spy balloons or camera balloons over China that it would then this was in film camera days, and it would then recover the film ejected from these balloons to get sort of a surveillance there. It's a technique that has been done. It's very strange, and you just have to kind of trust that you're going to collect something meaningful on the other end of it, even if you're throwing a sensor in a direction you don't exactly know.
I gotta say, Kelsey, I'm pretty disappointed in having a clear, concise, and a rational explanation for Roswell. I don't like it, and I'm just going to stick to the alien thing. Even though, the United States has admitted, like, yeah, there's UFOs, but literally it just means there's something and we don't know what the fuck it is, and then it went away. It could have been a Mylar balloon. It could have been a Chinese spy balloon. Who knows? Maybe we're only just now finding these out. But I am, the weather balloon kind of, I do like that they're like, no, it's a weather balloon and not a super secret Soviet sniffer balloon. You have to it's that little bit of, we got to tell the truth a little bit, but we also got to tell a lie a little bit. And in this instance, it just, it didn't work. I mean, I know Roswell has always been like, this is just a secret place where we test stuff because it's in the middle of nowhere and it's flat and it's hot and you can do whatever you want out here and nobody gives a shit because it's the middle of nowhere. So, kind of like White Sands, yeah, we can drop a nuke on White Sands. There's nothing there anymore, at least. So, Kelsey, the payload that it had, I understand, it's doing data collection, weather collection, but I mean, what about if it had flown over, like, say, Los Angeles or New York City and detonated an EMP? Then what are we going to do?
Well, first of all, we're going to roll back and say, detonated an EMP. Ocean's 11 is a good movie, and it's not Ocean's 11's fault. But an EMP, as can be produced at scale, at a replicable way that we know, really means it had detonated a nuclear bomb. That's how you produce an EMP. EMP explosions, as we know them, as we understand them, are high altitude nuclear blasts. It can happen at anything, but if you really want that area covering effect, if you are Newt Gingrich and you live every day of your sunset years fearing about what happens when you can't log into AOL again, then what you're really worried about is nuclear war, but you're putting a new term on it. So you could.
Yeah. The reason people are worried about EMPs is because EMPs might one day mean that they can't post. So personally, EMPs are very frightening. What if we couldn't podcast? What if we couldn't post on Twitter? Then what would we do? Lead normal lives? No, not for me.
I'd have to learn a trade with a clear contribution to society. It's very strange.
I'm gonna have to go learn how to code, I guess. I don't know what the kids are doing these days. They're all on TikTok trying to make money. That's why we know it's not something like this, because China is not going to completely eradicate our TikTok users to further their own thing. And EMP doesn't make any sense. What it should be is maybe a propaganda balloon that drops a whole bunch of hey, scan this QR code and you can post. I don't know anything about TikTok because I'm 40 and I refuse at this point. But Maybe it'll get you something extra. You download TikTok, you get Super TikTok, and it has like, double the spy software on it or something.
The QR codes would actually be, yeah, that would be a thing you could do. You could certainly distribute leaflets by balloon. I'm pretty sure they have. That's been a thing you've used balloons for. But yeah, so the reason there is a part of that. What if you put a weapon on a balloon? What happens? And what happens? One of the things we saw, and I was going through and I was looking back and you're saying like, well, we don't want to shoot the balloon down over Montana because we might hit something below in Montana, which you would not. There aren't things below in Montana. That's the nature of Montana. It's only barely not the least dense state.
You guys scare a bunch of... You gonna scare some deer or something, maybe. Freak out the local hermit, maybe, and move on, I guess.
Yeah. Right, but what happens is if a balloon-borne weapon is set off, then suddenly any concerns about not throwing the fanciest air-to-air superiority plane at it goes away. You just shoot it down, provided you can get close enough. Which again, like there are ceilings on how far planes can fly and how far missiles can go, but that was within what we could do. And you just shoot this thing down, and they did. And then, if it is a nuclear weapon, which you wouldn't want to do it that way. But if you did it that way, what would happen is you would have suddenly it would just be a very slow and unpredictable start to a nuclear war with clear attribution. And then that's where you end up. There's not a good way to do a sneak attack by balloon because they're the least sneaky vehicles in existence. An aircraft carrier is more subtle because at least the horizon can cover it at some point.
Yeah, big, slow, fat thing floating over that you can't really control. Especially for countries like us and China who have intercontinental ballistic missiles. Like if China wanted to nuke us, they wouldn't send a balloon over to do it. They wouldn't send any. Like all of this, it all just makes no sense as to why China would do anything conspiratorial. And I'm not here to say like I'm not a. China's never does anything wrong. Fucking China's just as bad as the rest of us. By us, I mean world powers. They have all their own problems. The Communist Party is not that communist as much as you want it to be. Just like the Soviets weren't all that great. So I feel like again there would have been something a bit more if this was something malicious. And at this point, it really does seem like a fuck up. And I can't imagine that fuck ups don't happen constantly, considering our own nuclear arsenal. You read any book about how we fucked up with nukes and almost nuked ourselves on more than one occasion. It happens. Luckily, there was no nuke attached to this balloon, so we could shoot it down. I am curious, though. Like, we had to send an F-22 up to shoot it down. And shout out to the F-22 airframe for getting its first air-to-air combat kill. But what can we shoot these things? I mean, 60,000 feet, what can you shoot that high with? Certainly not any of our anti-aircraft or our artillery or anything like that. It does kind of seem like if like China decided to send like 50 balloons over and just like one of them's got a nuke, good luck. What exactly can we do to shoot these down in an effective, quick way that isn't send a F-22 up at cost of millions of dollars to shoot down a weather balloon.
Sure. Well, if we want to scale it down to $1 to $3 million, a Patriot missile has a ceiling of 80,000 feet. So,
so we're good then.
I mean, we're genuinely like one of the things that has been the Patriot missile, which has its real limits. If you heard it was impressive during the first Gulf War, it wasn't. Those numbers were cooked. But it is good at stopping planes and high altitude bombers, and it would stop balloons. These are eminently shootable things if you can track them. What really stands out, right? And like if you wanted to put a weapon on a balloon, you have to trust that the wind will carry it where it wants to go, or you attach propulsion to it, at which point you greatly diminish or you either increase the size of the balloon, making it easier to spot and destroy, or you diminish the altitude and range at which it will go. You're weighing it down, you're causing it all sorts of problems. And there have been attempts to attach explosive to balloons and kind of launch them indiscriminately. This is at a much smaller scale, like the tactical scale, or like the person scale, really. And you could kind of do that if you need an indiscriminate way to just throw an explosive into the air. It's not a great or effective way, but if you're just causing mayhem, then whatever. But it's an eminently stoppable thing. And what stands out to me about all of this is not just that that it caught the attention for such a goofy vehicle, but that it happened before and it wasn't made a big deal of. And some of it is that this was made a big deal because it shut down an airport and it would have been visible in the sky, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that big of a deal. There's all sorts of things that happen that people don't go out and look at. There are satellites flying overhead. Sputnik was a big deal when it first happened, when it was the first satellite. It didn't even have any meaningful sensors. It just said it was in space. But when you haven't seen satellites before, a new star is real weird. So the other thing, but there becomes a time, right? Satellites get super common, and now when we see there's satellite constellations, right? Starlink things, and they look like streaks across the night sky. That's a little weird. But it's not something that people feel inherently threatened by. You don't have to feel inherently threatened by the existence of balloons. In fact, there's U.S. case law that I believe is still good. It's been a little while since I covered the civilian drone world, where this came over a lot, that said the limit for expected privacy in your backyard ends at 400 feet above the ground, which is an old...
Wait, does that mean that I can legally shoot down... I can shoot down those goofy little drones that people fly? If somebody does that, I can... below 400 feet, that's pretty low. I could probably hit something with a shotgun there.
So, first, my understanding is you're not actually supposed to fly drones above 400 feet, so it kind of excludes all of that. But what it means is that police are under no expectation to serve you a warrant if they are looking in your backyard for something from a helicopter, which was the case law in good old Florida, good old fun case of helicopter expectancy on privacy in backyards and all that. But the thing that stands out, right, is that there are reports that we had this multiple times in the Trump administration and no big deal was made of it. It might have been that I do not believe that President Trump would have said, no, don't use the good plane to shoot down the Chinese balloon if given the option. I think if someone had put that on a plane for him, he would have done the exact same call. For someone who is nothing if not into the deepest strains of American kitsch, it would have been a thing he would have talked about up until he tried to overthrow the government upon leaving office, and probably after still. But it seems like it's a kind of thing that just happens. That
I can't remember if Trump was one of those was good with China or not. I know he was all buddy with North Korea. I can't remember if he was buddy with China or not. Because he always tried to keep those good relations with authoritarian governments open. Because game recognizes game.
He absolutely loved oppressing dictators, and he also really loved theatrics. So it's hard to know what would have happened if someone had said, "Hey, do you want to be the first president to order a stealth fighter to kill a Chinese aircraft, but not one that will risk nuclear war?" They might not have even had to say that. He would have just been on board either way. But what stands out, right, is the idea that there's kind of routine surveillance that nations send and watch other nations' stuff all the time. One of the things that came out, I believe it was in a CNN report, was that the balloon was not spotted first by sensors or radar in the air or military, Continental Defense or NORAD. NORAD tracked it after it was recognized, but that the balloon was first identified by other intelligence tools, which means the CIA had some asset somewhere, figure it out, or they were either in some China's computers or had someone listening. That's when you say other assets, then sensors, that's what you're referring to is people in some way. And this just happens. This is a thing that countries do. I found by sheer coincidence, I was poking around looking for balloons on DVIDs, the Defense Department's repository of public domain images. And they had this goofy one, looked like a postage stamp, of cartoon balloons with cartoon-like film cameras flying from the United States to China. And this was in 1956. And this was something called...
Hell yeah.
Project Genetrix, which was a way to get meteorological and photographic evidence of China and the Soviet Union. And it was just balloons that were sent out with cameras, 500 of them. I think there's stuff out there.
Oh my God. It was a program designed to launch General Mills manufactured surveillance balloons. The fucking Lucky Charms motherfuckers.
Yeah! Yeah! And eventually we you know what would be better than balloons? What if we had a spy plane? What if it was something that we could steer?
Right. The balloon is good as like a passive thing, I guess, but it is like we have better things. We have, you can... It's like all the people who are really into like traditional stuff is like, no, I need to go out and like chop my own wood and do these manual labor things because I'm so manly. It's like we have better. There's a reason we stopped doing that. It's because we invented better ways to do it. So I mean, if you really want to, like, if China wants to send off a spy balloon, fine. I would feel like that a spy balloon would be more, kind of a country with. I don't want to like disparage countries or the people inside of them, but some place that doesn't spend the vast majority of their GDP on military hardware probably might use a spy balloon. Just like, hey, chuck the spy balloon up. We can, the Etropians can check in on the Arianans if they need to with the spy balloon. It really feels like China wouldn't waste their time with something like that.
Right, and there's something that we have, and I think one of the things, and we certainly see this, I think you and I, with our familiarity with the Department of Defense, but there's this idea that even if there's a better thing out there, what if there's a balloon gap? What if there's a medium space capability? Last week, before all this went down, I wrote about a DARPA contract that some DARPA contracts, they love to be like, hey, here's this fun, cool thing we're doing for like electric supersonic or quiet supersonic or something. It's like, okay, sure, that seems like a thing you'd like to talk about. And this one, though, it's called Daedalus. They wrote about it at Popular Science, and it is for very low Earth orbit satellites. It's like, okay, we already have low Earth orbit. That's where most satellites go. That's where all the surveillance satellites are, unless they're in geostationary orbit. Those are like the big useful parts of around Earth. But what if we had one in very low Earth orbit? What could you do if it was just 450 miles off the ground instead of like the 1,000 miles of low Earth orbit? And it's unclear. Maybe you have better cameras. Again, maybe many of the things you'd want there, but it's one of the things like we could put satellites there because we can, and why not? What if someone else figures it out first? Then there will be less orbit for us to put satellites in. And there's this bizarre need to fill every gap, we're
going to have an orbit gap.
Right! Yeah, so I think, like, my understanding, right, they're the useful balloons, and this is something I think to talk about, right? If we're talking about, like, the way militaries have used balloons for a long time, and the tethered balloons is a big way to do it, right? The J-lens balloons are tethered until they aren't, and they wreak havoc across rural Pennsylvania. As famously happened in
we had that happen once or twice in Afghanistan too. Just like, hey, where'd the balloon go? Oh, somebody's getting yelled at.
Which, like, of course the tether could break. That's the nature. That Hasn't anyone seen the red balloon? Doesn't the Pentagon know what they're doing?
Does the Pentagon know what they're doing, Kelsey? No, I don't. I'm not going to put that kind of onus on them. I want to before we get too far away from it, one other thing from Project Genetrix that I love is that the Soviets recovered many of these balloons, and the radiation hardened film that was inside of it, they stole it out of there to take the first pictures of the dark side of the moon. So while the Soviets may have been the first ones to get the picture, it was our technology. So I mean, if they still existed, I would say you're welcome. But I'm just going to go ahead and use the fact that you don't exist and I do as the win here.
Also, what a cooler use of that film. What a great way to use it.
Right. Just like, because it's just like, okay, you've built me something that will survive like space. Sure, let's shoot something into space and use your film, I guess. Like, if you find $20 laying on the ground, you're not just going to be like, oh, this is $20 that I should give to somebody else. No, you're going to put that in your own pocket, man. Just like temperature resistant, radiation hardened film.
Homer Simpson contemplating, yes, this special film can be used to take many pictures of the moon before the Americans do it. So tethered balloons are a big thing, and one of the reasons for tethered balloons, and this is something dating back to like the Civil War balloons where you have the telegram and the wire, is you need a way to communicate off of it. And I think if there's something in the open source that comes up, if someone, some ham radio or maybe a different kind of, but some radio hobbyist or person who tracks these things picks it up, how the balloon was communicating and what it was transmitting is the most interesting, I think, piece of the puzzle. Because in a tether, you just have a wire. You don't have to broadcast it. It's not snoopable in the same way. And it's useful. You get the information there. You can transfer a huge bandwidth, which is what you need if you're doing video from the sky. Or you need a really elaborate satellite network, as we use for like drone surveillance. But like if you're not a country that has a massive satellite network and global infrastructure to relay your own communications separate from commercial communications, then tethered balloons are a great way to go. There's a lot you can do with them. There's a huge market for them. They show up. Obviously, the U.S. has used them in Afghanistan, but we put them on the border for reasons. We have ones watching the J-lens that got loose and wandered through the mid-Atlantic, I want to say in 2016. That one was supposed to be looking for cruise missiles for some reason. But you can do lots of things. It's interesting to see balloons as useful in war, again, in a big way, or in military purposes. But what's scary that you could connect to them is all stuff done with the information and done later. There's nothing, I think, inherently fearful about the balloon itself. And that might just be the balloon fiesta goer in me speaking.
And like I said, I'm with you. I'm not, even if this was a balloon sent over with nefarious purposes, come on, China, you can do better than that. Like, we're already watching that, like, our great longtime enemy, the Russians, are just getting absolutely shellacked by, their. To be fair, we're giving the Ukrainians a lot of weapons, but we're not even giving them like our most up to date stuff. We're giving them shit that's like, hey, we shot this shit at Soviets too once upon a time. You guys want to do that? Here's some HIMARS. Here's some some Bradleys and stuff. Knock yourselves out. So we need to be properly afraid of another country, and that country is supposed to be China, I would assume. But here, if this is a nefarious spy purpose, like, you guys kind of suck at this. Why don't you go back to making more videos of like your guys punching bricks or something? That's always that. I'm always big on the propaganda. Military propaganda films that show like the Spetsnaz dudes doing backflips and throwing axes and shit, or the Chinese PLA soldiers like punching bricks and whatnot, or breaking them with their heads. Like, that's cool. Can you do that? So like when I fire a fucking hellfire at you, you gonna headbutt that out of the way? That's fine. We may be the wokest army, but we're also the most deadly for a fucking reason. I've kissed the Army's ass a lot today. I should stop doing that. I just get, when you get the like the fight up in it, just like, oh, what does this balloon mean? What's going on here? And more than likely, it's absolutely nothing. But when you have to play the what if game, it's like, I mean, it could have been, I guess, but probably not. And if it was, then you don't really have anything to worry about here.
Sure. So just really, really quickly, my big thought on this, right? And this is sort of the, I chose to set aside the Newt Gingrich's stuff that I was writing, but obviously saving the quality content for the pod. But if the balloon is the thing you're scared of, then your threat calculus is off, and it's a drastic misreading of just inherently what the U.S. has on hand. And not to, I cover this beat. I don't try to be like a booster, but just the simple material reality of, oh yeah, the United States can casually have the first air-to-air kill by its top-of-the-line air superiority stealth fighter be a balloon because that's what's on hand to do it, and you can wait until it's over the ocean so you don't have to risk the possibility that it hits something in Montana. And so it's to be afraid of the balloon.
Well, it went all, it could look. It's not like, oh, I'm afraid that the balloon is gonna explode or have a bomb on it. But like, just in general, I don't want a balloon to fall on my house. Like, or re-entering stuff that, like, when they re-enter stuff from space in, like, oh, we're done with this, we're gonna chuck it back into the Earth's atmosphere to burn up. They always dump it in the ocean somewhere. We got plenty of water to do that. It's like, chuck it in the ocean. Kind of the same thing here. It's just like nobody. Even, because they waited till it was over the coasts. So obviously it moved from Montana and kept going. They shot it over the Atlantic, I believe, right? So it's, they could have had a balloon land. Imagine how embarrassing, Kelsey, it would be if we shot this balloon down and then it was just stuck on the top of the Freedom Tower in New York City. And then we had to have a whole thing about how do we get it down? How do we get the spy balloon down off of the giant building? And then that's going to be a whole thing. Then we got to listen to Mayor Adams talk bullshit and talk about cops somehow, because that's what he does. I don't know. I feel like we made the right move. Shoot it down over the ocean and just let's all move on and never talk about it again.
It's absolutely the right move, but it's one of the things where it's the idea of being afraid of the balloon when it could be dealt with so gingerly and shot down at our leisure is a sign of absolute strength. And to talk about it as like, oh no, the fact that air currents can carry balloons across continents, that is old news. That is 1944 news. We do not need to worry about it. It's not really a thing. It's doing surveillance. So are satellites. Is it collecting data rigorously? Not nearly as rigorously as TikTok. There are many other dimensions to focus on instead. But I'm always happy to talk about a machine that seems inherently goofy with ominous overtones.
That is one of my fortes. That's why I had a whole enamel pin designed behind the Davy Crockett nuclear bomb launcher that could be launched by 3 dudes on the ground to shoot at other dudes on the ground. Completely insane. I absolutely love it. Never got used in real life for a very good reason. Kelsey, thank you so much for coming on. Why don't you go ahead and tell people where they can find you?
Sure, you can find a lot of my work at Popular Science. You can find me on Twitter at AthertonKD. You can find my longer and more freeform writing on stuff like Andor or how Britain debuted tanks by gendering them over at AthertonKD Substack. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.